Morning, welcome to Comprehensive Futures Sunday event, a very special event entitled What Would a Socially Just Education System Look Like? This event, my friends, is scheduled to last from now until 12:30, and it's a great opportunity to explore both a current issue and really a recurring theme in the British political discourse. Perhaps I can just start by setting the scene. My name's John Bercow, and I served for just over a decade as Speaker of the House of Commons, so I have some experience of trying to keep naturally disorderly people in some sort of order. Whether that will adequately qualify me, ladies and gentlemen, for coping with all of you, a formidable assemblage of education-interested persons, remains to be seen. Whether it will equip me to cope with our highly illustrious, well-furnished minds on the panel, who are going to expatiate with some eloquence, again, I'll leave you to judge. But in setting the scene, I just wanted to say a very small number of things. First of all, I think by common consent, the pandemic has exposed, and I would argue exacerbated, educational inequalities. Inequalities such as the digital divide, food poverty, which is part of educational inequality, and exam inequality to boot. The 11 plus, I'm shocked to report, though no doubt you know, went ahead as usual during the pandemic with predictable results. Children from more affluent families who had access to online tuition were at an even greater advantage than disadvantaged pupils who did not enjoy such access. That is certainly a theme that we need to explore, because there is arguably a danger and perhaps an evident reality that the inequality is greater now than it was even 18 months ago. Secondly, I just mentioned, in case you think, well, what else is this bloke doing here? We know he used to yell order at people, and we sometimes saw his ugly mug on the television screen, but we can't quite understand why he's chairing this event. Well, I suppose the short answer is that I was invited, ladies and gentlemen, to do so. But why was I invited? The answer is that I'm a patron of Comprehensive Future, a group which campaigns to end the 11 plus and to ensure fair school admission. In that context, I should mention that I'm a parent myself, despite my vast age, of 3 school-age children, and they all attend a London state comprehensive school. So I have got a personal interest in these matters, as well as an abstract educational or political interest. Thirdly, I should mention to you that the event hashtag for Twitter is important, and I would urge you to highlight the significance of this event and what is said by tweeting using the hashtag EduJustice. Lastly, I mentioned, by way of trying to prepare you for the worst scenario, it's possible, I hope it won't be the case, but it is possible, ladies and gentlemen, that there won't be time for questions in addition to our 3 intended guest questioners. We will therefore use the Q&A box to collect questions for the panel throughout the event and to put up a selection on the Comprehensive Future website. That way we ensure that this is not just a one-off event. It is not an isolated debate, a now or never. Rather, there is the opportunity for the debate to continue on what a socially just education would look like. That debate can continue amongst other places on our website, and I hope it will do so. I come now to the panel, and at the risk of embarrassing our panel, I feel I can say that it's brilliant. And I feel I can say that, ladies and gentlemen, with complete confidence and no fear of contradiction and no accusation of arrogance, because I am not a member of the panel. I don't aspire to such a status. I am simply trying to chair the panel's deliberations. And the panel consists of three people. Dr. Alan Bainbridge. Now, Alan is a chartered psychologist, doctor of clinical science, and senior lecturer in education. And in addition to that academic distinction, he taught in Kent's secondary schools for almost 20 years. So he's got both the academic distinctions that I've noted and the practical experience of observing at the coalface, if you will, the iniquities of the selective system. He is a member of Comprehensive Future Steering Committee and the joint coordinator of the Kent Education Network Anti-Selection Group. We'll come to him in a moment. Our second speaker, because this is the order, Alan first, is Sammy Wright. Sammy is Vice Principal of Southmore Academy in Sunderland and the Social Mobility Commission's lead for schools and HE. I'm going to give a puff or a shout out for his first novel entitled Fit, and that novel comes out next month, available, I'm advised, in all good bookshops and I believe accessible on Amazon to boot. You may consider it your social or moral duty to purchase a copy of the book. I leave that moral dilemma for you individually to resolve. And thirdly, but by no means last, we have on our panel Ash Sarkar, whom I've never had the pleasure of meeting one-to-one, but I'm meeting her two-dimensionally today, and I've heard her on innumerable occasions. I have been dazzled by her combination of intellect and eloquence on Sky News Review and elsewhere. She's a journalist and political activist. She's a senior editor at Novara Media, which is very well known as the expression of a particular set of political opinions, and she's a regular contributor to The Guardian and The Independent. She has also taught at the Sandberg Institute in Amsterdam. So an eclectic mix of people who have one thing in common, and that is that they are immensely able and they know what they're talking about, of which you will now find ample and I hope inspiring evidence. So, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I say, and I've just had a very friendly message from Melissa Ben, which is warmly reciprocated. Thank you. We should give a warm, albeit virtual, welcome to our first speaker, who will address us for up to 5 minutes. I'm going to have to be tough on the time, up to 5 minutes. Dr. Alan Bainbridge.
Thank you, John, and welcome to everybody else who's out there. It's been slightly over 5 minutes. I'm going to read, and I've timed it a number of times. Here we go. There are advantages being the first panelist to speak. I can get my clever insights out there and then sit back, learn from my colleagues and get ready for the questions. At the start, I wish to be clear who my comments today are aimed at. I wish to address my thoughts at those who are in positions of power to make decisions on education policy. I did, via Twitter, invite them to today's webinar, but if they are not here, perhaps those of you who are present could help me make sure that they know what a socially just education looks like. After all, these people should know. It's their job to review evidence and make informed decisions. So here comes my clever insight. Children who attend local well-resourced schools do well, academically and socially. Children attending schools in a selective area do less well, if not worse, particularly the longer they are in compulsory education. And to add to this, these areas are more unequal and have less social cohesion than areas that have comprehensive education. I've not made this up. This is what research has told us over decades, and this is what the data reveals year after year. To step outside of the data, I'm going to tell you a story of what it's like when policymakers lack either the knowledge or are too scared to listen to the evidence or to listen to professional experience. I'm going to tell the story of selective education in Kent as it might be experienced by children, parents, teachers, and our elected members responsible for education. In Kent, unlike almost all other counties and countries across the globe, we segregate our children from the age of 11. We segregate boys and girls. We segregate those on long-term free school meals compared to those who are not. We segregate those with additional educational needs. We segregate children from well-resourced families from children whose families are not so fortunate. We segregate children who score more than 332 or less than 332 in a silly, short, multiple choice test, and more on this later. We segregate friends, families, neighbours, and communities. The very existence of selection, sorting, and grading, to quote the words of Raymond Williams, creates the unreliable and valued judgment distinction between good schools and bad schools. Imagine a young child in primary school grappling with digraphs, fractions, the Romanization of Britain, and then gradually discussions will creep in about which secondary school you will go to. Will it be the good grammar school or the bad secondary modern school? If your family has the resources and the inclination, you might find those once playful evenings spent watching television or avoiding tidying your room have been replaced by spending time with a private tutor who, for around £40 an hour, will guarantee 11+ success. You may even find your summer holidays shortened to attend 11+ summer schools. If not, you may of course be left wondering what your friends are doing. And if it's so important, why don't your parents do it for you? To be very clear, I'm not blaming parents. We all want the best for our children, and the policymakers keep telling us good schools level up, and selection means you can go to a good school. Of course, what is left hidden and cruelly cut out of the scene is the notionally bad schools where failures end up. What must it be like for parents standing outside the school gates, listening to the stories of how other parents are planning to secure their child's place in a good school? What must it be like to know that some parents have been planning since infant school or earlier for the mysterious 11+? Let's talk about the 11+. What must it be like to be 9 years old in August and then to find out on the 9th of September, when you are just 10, your ability to answer about 130 questions in 2 one-hour multiple choice tests could determine whether you go to a good school or a bad school? What must it be like to be a teacher, a professional educator who has watched a child's learning, witnessed the struggles and successes, only to have your detailed and caring professional judgment of a child cast aside because 328 or 342 is deemed to better represent the child you know so well? What must it be like as a teenager, standing at the bus stop early in the morning, getting used to growing bodies, working out who you are and which bands are cool or not cool, as a separate bus comes for the children going to the good school, while you have to get on the crowded regular bus? What must it be like to go to one of those good schools to be told that you are better, only to wish that you could still have a laugh with your mate, now on the other bus, at lunchtime? And what about those shared envious and jealous glances across streets, bus stops and playgrounds that often erupt into bullying and name-calling? What must it be like, and I pause because this actually happened, what must it be like when the good school near you gets £19 million to build extra classrooms, and then, because the local authority, believing in fairness, they decide to spend another £15 million on another good school because it's another gender? Finally, what must it be like to be responsible for education policy and to know, or at least they should know, all that I have just presented, for it is well documented and frequently reported, but to sit back and do nothing and watch existing division become even more entrenched? I wonder what that's like. Thank you for listening.
Alan, thank you very much indeed. I think that was an arresting presentation, and it will have given much food for thought to everybody attending, as well as being a great start to the contributions from the panel. So, Alan, thanks very much indeed. Let's move now to Sammy. Sammy Wright, whom I introduced a few moments ago, and to whom I know you'll all now want to listen. Sammy.
Thank you. I'm going to try and talk in quite a broad sense about education and social justice. And I'd like to start by thinking about what we actually think school is for. Now, in teaching circles, there's a lot of debate, and it gets quite heated at times when people talk about things like the knowledge-rich curriculum, and they compare it to skills, and sometimes other people talk about schools being about more of a sense of self-actualization, so kind of finding who you are. And all these different approaches to schools are often set up as different ways of providing social justice. So people say that the knowledge-rich curriculum is a forum for social justice because it democratizes knowledge and it gives access to everyone. Equally, other people say that skills are the route to social justice because that prepares everyone for the workplace. I'd like to just make a bit of a corrective to this before I go any further, which is to say that I think that's a false debate. I think that any good school provides all three of those three things. It's just that sometimes they give different weights in how they describe themselves. And I've visited many schools in my time, and you always see that all three of those are present. So actually, I think rather than debating about the nitty-gritty of what's going on in schools, we need to widen what we think. So we need to think about why it is that across the piece there is a problem. Now, I supported a piece of research for the Social Mobility Project Commission that we published in July, and it was called Against the Odds. And this arose from a question I had, and I asked this about a year and a half ago, can I see which schools there are that close the gap between disadvantaged and non-disadvantaged students? So I just wanted to know. And the research project, went its way, and they came back with me, and they told me that there were 11 secondary schools across the whole of England that actually closed the disadvantage gap. And then when I looked at those 11 schools, 6 were grammar schools with vanishingly small numbers of disadvantaged students. 3 were ex-private, another one was an ex-grammar, and the last one had been investigated for off-rolling. So none of them were valid examples of how one can actually close the gap in a real example. And if you look at the kind of schools that are held up as shining examples to all of us, many different types of schools, none of them closed the gap. Now this to me tells us that there is systemic problems here. Now I'm going to park that thought for 1 second, and I'm going to go in a slightly different direction. Because one of the other things people do is they often highlight other systems. So they talk about Singapore, they talk about Finland, they talk about Germany. They say Singapore, look, that's a great example of the knowledge-rich curriculum. They talk about Germany, they say, look at the technical education there. They talk about Finland, look at how young people are allowed to find their own direction and experience a much more rounded curriculum. I would say, again, that trying to hold up these different systems is it's a false choice here, because actually what those 3 different systems do is they show that there are 3 very different societies around which those systems are built. So in Singapore, you have a knowledge-rich curriculum because you have a highly skilled workforce and you have a very high availability of knowledge-rich jobs. In Finland, you have a very low population, widely spaced out with a very high welfare state. And in Germany, you have an extremely significant manufacturing base. So in each of those instances, we actually need to look at the society around the system in order to understand the education system. So if we come back to Britain and we look at our system, what we can see is that in Britain, we have an educational system that is highly competitive, which creams off the top in order to give them the best opportunities in society, and then has a vast range of kind of mid-level outcomes that don't lead to what we might conventionally term as success. And in the society around that, well, that matches perfectly, doesn't it? We have an unequal society that has a heavy weighting of excellent job opportunities at the top, some really poor, low status, low stability jobs at the bottom, and a range of mid-level jobs that are increasingly de-skilled. So actually, if we're thinking about trying to make our education system just and fair, we need to start with our society. And we need to find opportunities for people in our society, because actually, if I look at my experience in schools, what I see is that young people are not stupid. And if they look around them, say, for example, in the Northeast where I work, they look around them and they see there are no opportunities and that actually their qualifications aren't going to get them anywhere, then they make a rational choice and don't engage with school. So if we then kind of put those two parts of what I've said together, on the one hand, we aren't closing this disadvantage gap anywhere. And on the other hand, we have a school system that reflects the inequalities of our society. You might then kind of turn around to me and say, that just sounds pretty bleak. What can we do about it? And in one sense, I do feel it's pretty bleak. But I think that there are certain key things that we can look at to move forward. If we start with the disadvantage gap, the reason we have a disadvantage gap is because poverty is bloody awful. Young people in poverty experience a huge amount of stress and trauma. If we can reduce that, then we help them. Whether or not their GCSEs increase or not is, kind of by the by, but they will come out of school much more functional if they have experienced less trauma along the way. So we need to fix our welfare system, we need to fix our early years education system, and we need to support young people out of poverty. And if we do that, then a lot of the other things will start to follow. Secondly, in the school system, we need to think about separating our idea of merit from the idea of education. Because our society demands that we have these kind of meritocratic hierarchies and systems, and that we sort people into their appropriate stages. And maybe we need that. Maybe that is the way the world is. But I think that we can get away from maybe valuing people according to their meritocratic ranking. And at the moment, we have this kind of psychological trap where, you see it in the papers where someone says, oh, they're a straight-A student, as if that means they're a good person. So if we can separate merit from knowledge, that would be great. Then the third thing is we need to introduce a lottery for places in education. And when I say that, there are many ways of doing it. I don't have time to go into the detail, but I'm just going to put one version of this forward, which I think is the most important, and it's perhaps one that's hard to stomach. But we need to have lotteries for university places. Why is it that we accept that selectivity is difficult at schools, and then we allow universities to be so intensely selective? At the level that they do it, places like Oxford, Cambridge, UCL, King's College, Manchester, there is no meaningful distinction between the student that they accept and the one that they don't. So instead of thinking about them being allowed to cream off the very top, then what we need to do is say, if you reach the threshold where your qualifications will allow you to access a course, you have an equal chance of getting on that course. Thank you.
Sammy, thank you very much indeed for an excellent tour d'horizon of the issues as you see them. And the takeout point for me, for you all to ponder, but you'll choose to ponder on what you want from Sammy's contribution, is that we cannot view education, ladies and gentlemen, in isolation from the society of which it is a part. And Sammy spoke compellingly on that theme, that yes, the system as it exists is unjust, but that is not an accident in, but rather directly related to the unequal and unjust society which surrounds us. So, Sammy, thank you for that. I think we've got very clear messages from Alan and Sammy. I think I'm going soft in my old age, ladies and gentlemen, because Alan and Sammy have willfully disregarded and shown total contempt for my exhortations to stick to 5 minutes, but it has to be said that the quality was very high. Now, I know when the struggle is too great and I'm up against a Leviathan, I don't think I'm going to be able to stop Ash in her tracks. So we will now listen to the flow of her eloquence and the eloquence of her flow. Ash Sarkar.
Well, I've got to move a 9-week-old kitten from my notes who really loves being around laptops. So sorry if he takes over and makes a little cameo. Sammy and Alan's contributions were wonderful, and I think Sammy's key point about you cannot expect a socially just education system in a society which doesn't reflect and prioritize those same values is absolutely core to what it is that I want to say. And when I was preparing for this talk, I was thinking about what even is a socially just education system, and how is that distinct and different from prioritizing social justice more generally in people's experiences of childhood? How is it different from a socially just housing system, a healthcare system, a welfare system? And I think that there is a core value, which maybe we could all agree on, which determines whether or not something is socially just. And it's whether or not you consider people to be disposable. And I think that unfortunately, we have an education system which very much does consider children to be disposable, whether they're the kid who gets into, as has been mentioned before, the good school or the bad school, whether you've got education policies which do encourage off-rolling of disadvantaged and challenging students in order to maintain their GCSE results and look good when it comes to flashing a bit of ankle at anxious middle-class parents. We consider children to be disposable when we send them to grammar schools which, having attended one for sixth form, nurture quite a toxic culture around extreme academic competitiveness, where if you fall short by a few marks, you're treated like you're utterly contemptible, that you're not worthy of validation, approval, or love. And we teach kids that they're disposable when we send them to schools and have such unrealistically high expectations of what it is education can do. But we send them home with hungry bellies to challenging backgrounds where maybe they have to be a carer for a parent or be a substitute for an absent parent, or simply help out a parent who is just about keeping their head above the poverty line. And the reason why I talk about this is because I grew up in an area where over half the kids grew up in poverty. And I think that statistic has gotten worse. And I saw firsthand the way in which schools could be an effective bulwark against some of the worst of what society could throw at these kids. And I also saw where schools failed to do that utterly. And I'm coming at this, just to be clear, I'm coming at this from a sincere belief that education is inherently emancipatory, that it is inherently liberating. And so I think that we can't have unrealistic expectations of what the education system can do. I think it's also important to insist that critical interrogation, the tools to understand the world around you and indeed shape the world around you, is inherently freeing. And that's before we get into all the stuff about what skills the jobs market needs, or indeed social mobility. So I went to a comprehensive school in North London for my secondary education. I then went to a selective grammar for sixth form. And I've got to say that it was the comprehensive school which, for all of its flaws and the challenges in which it operated, I think offered the superior vision of what a socially just education system could look like. By virtue of being in Enfield, it was very diverse, but that diversity wasn't simply measured in racial diversity or ethnic diversity. You had a pupil intake which ranged from girls who came from solidly middle and lower middle class homes to the daughters of refugees, girls who'd gone in and out of the care system. And I think what was most striking about that school and the ethos which shaped how the teachers interacted with their pupils, was that not one of you is going to get kicked out. You're not going to get excluded. You're not going to get suspended. You can be really difficult and you are not going to leave the walls of this school. It was an all-girls school, which I know there are issues with proposing single-sex segregation as an option in schools, but one of the consequences of that was that we had particularly high rates of teenage pregnancies, because you had double the amount of people who could get pregnant. But also we were growing up in an area which, looking back on it, the way in which girls were thrown onto the mercy of men, both their own age and older, was really disturbing. So we had a high rate of teenage pregnancies, and we had teachers who not once dipped a toe into the narratives of slut shaming, or that you've done something so wrong by falling pregnant, sometimes choosing to have a baby, that you're not deserving of engagement and an educational experience. I think that was something which was incredibly important. Whereas the sixth form grammar that I attended, Latimer School in Edmonton, it was a selective grammar which was plonked right in the middle of one of the most deprived bits of North London. And I could count on one hand the number of students who were actually drawn from the local area. And this insane chasm between the pupils who were at the school and the area that was situated in created, in some ways, quite a stressful and anxious experience for the kids at that school. They're identifiable by their uniform, and they kept getting jumped on the bus, their phones nicked, lunchboxes nicked, their money nicked, because that uniform was essentially a flag flown in the face of these other kids who went to Elwood, went to Ashmole, that they were less valued as children, that they were stupider, that they were more criminal, that they were more difficult, that they were more violent. So no wonder these poor year sevens with their giant rucksacks all got jumped on the bus. It was something which I thought was really toxic, not just to the pupils who went to Elwood and also Latimer, but corrosive for the social cohesion of the area as a whole. And I think there's maybe one last thing that I want to talk about when I'm talking about the disposability of children, why that is, I think, such a toxic thing to have entrenched within our education system. It's that we're told that kids being disposable, that there are high standards, and if kids fail to meet them, they'll either be marginalized within the school community or kicked out of it altogether. But that's what makes a good school. We're told that that's what makes an effective educational environment, whether that is a high-performing academy or a grammar school or indeed a fee-paying school. And so I think that one of the things that a socially just education system could do within the context of a society which prioritizes the value that no person is disposable would be, why do we define performance by cheating on your homework and getting rid of the most challenging kinds of people that it is your job to value, to educate, and to support? I don't think that it's possible for us to have this conversation without thinking about the ways in which the academic competitiveness of London state schools, and in some ways enforced by the overstuffed pupil referral units that we have across this city. I also don't think that we can talk about the educational attainment at London schools when at the same time in my area, you've got kids who are going to pretty decent state school by academic standards, but have to walk through an estate where they're simply not safe to walk through. Between Tottenham and Wood Green, it's not safe to walk that half-a-mile journey. So unless you start thinking about the way in which housing policy, the children's social care area, the way in which the welfare system, the way the availability of jobs which don't keep your mum out of the house for over 12 hours a day because she's going between 3 cleaning jobs in 3 different bits of London, unless we're thinking about how all these areas can support children, not just in education, but throughout their lives, giving them an experience of life which is worthwhile, which doesn't make them feel disposable. I think that this conversation of a socially just education system is not only myopic, but perhaps doomed to fail.
Ash, thank you very much indeed. I think everybody will have enjoyed that contribution, as they did Sammy's and Alan's. And there, it seems to me, the essence of the matter, in your judgment, is the intrinsic competitivity of our system, as distinct from one that might be thought to be more collaborative, focused on the best for everybody, rather than the notion that you have to have a kind of Darwinian survival of the fittest, which ultimately is a route to injustice and corrosive of the sort of community values that you and others espouse, and which perhaps should form the basis of a socially just education system. My warm thanks to Alan, to Sami, and to Ash for what they've said so far. More to follow, and I'm trying to give you a kind of oral pen portrait, ladies and gentlemen, as to what follows. We now come to the second part of our webinar, where we have 3 guest questioners who will each be given the floor to ask their questions, and those questions will be directed in each case at one of our 3 panelists. And I'm going to come first to, I'm sorry to be ageist, but our youngest contributor, and I'm incredibly excited by the arrival of our youngest contributor, Doria Ngese. Now, in case you don't know Doria, and I've got a feeling you're going to learn more about Doria in the months and years to come, she represents the Centre for Education and Youth. And I do want to add, in case she's too self-effacing to make the point, that she is off to study politics and sociology at Warwick University next month, with which, Doria, we wish you every possible success. Congratulations on that achievement, getting to that institution, doing that course, and combining it with what is obviously important vocational campaigning and advocacy work that you're doing as well. I believe I'm right in saying that you have a question to put to Sami Wright, and we are going to hear it. I will introduce, if I may, each of the other 2 panelists at the appropriate moment. But first of all, I urge you, ladies and gentlemen, to be alert to and ready for the benefit of Doria Ngese's question. Doria.
Hi everyone, and thank you for that introduction, John. The Centre for Education and... Ooh, can you hear me?
Speak up a little.
Oh, okay. Hi everyone, good afternoon. The Centre for Education and Youth Research shows that we often expect schools to do everything for young people. Have you any suggestions for all the different public services and agencies that people encounter during their school life might better collaborate so that young people are better supported?
So I hope everybody got that. Conceptually, it was extremely clear. How can the public services as a whole better engage with, take account of, and give support to young people, a subject of which Doria has got close personal experience, and her question does very much relate to the general theme, I think, of Sami's opening remarks. Sami, what's your response?
So I think it's an excellent question, and it's a really important area for development. There was a proposal a number of years ago called extended schools, and the idea of this was that schools would become hubs for a variety of different services.
Well, there is at this moment, ladies and gentlemen, which I regard as thoroughly pernicious, a possibly ideologically motivated interruption to our proceedings, which is preventing Sami giving an excellent answer to Doria's question. You can tell that, as I sometimes did in the House, in the chair, when it was necessary to fill time, I am playing for time here and hoping that the link will be re-established and that Sami will be able to continue his answer to Doria. Sami, have we got you back? If we haven't, I hope we will soon do so. But if it is necessary for me quickly to hop being the operative word, to our next questioner, I will, and then we will come back as necessary to Sammy as soon as Joanne Bartley can be reassured that the link is back. Sammy, the link is back. The playing for time might have worked. Sammy, can you please continue your answer? And Maggie Browning, with her customary patience, will await her turn. Sammy.
So, as I was saying, extended schools was a great idea, I think, that would have been a hub for bringing all these things together. As we are at the moment, I think that we have a bit of a vacuum, because one of the things that's happened is after the LEAs had a lot of the schools taken away from them in the process of academisation. And I should say, by the way, I'm not against academisation, nor am I against some of the reforms that have been in schools recently. I think we've got to be very careful about being too reactive and automatically thinking that because one thing has happened, we have to go in the opposite direction. I think we have to build on what's happened.
Thank you. Well, we've got a flavour from Sammy. I must say I would like the full dessert rather than a slice of his cake. And I think we've got him back again. Gosh, some of these reactionary selectivists, if I can call them that, really are doing their best to undermine us. But ladies and gentlemen, it won't work. It won't work. It simply won't work. We're just going to keep going until Sammy has completed his answer. Sammy. This is so unfair. It's monstrously unjust, almost as unjust as our socially unjust education system. Well, I fear for now we'll have to leave Sammy there, but I'm hoping to motor on and make sure that we get to other questions. And we do now come, can I say a big thank you and congratulations again to Dorea. And Dorea, we wish you huge success at Warwick and in everything that you go on to do educationally and in terms of campaigning for a fairer system and a fairer society. We'll come in a moment to Councillor Maggie Browning, a secondary school teacher and member of the Fabian Society. And I know that Maggie wants to put a question. We hopefully will have the chance to come back to you, Sammy. As I used to say in the House to people who were waiting, I'm saving the Honourable Gentleman up. I'm saving him up, or I'm saving the Honourable Lady up. It would seem unfair to squander him or her at too early a stage of our proceedings. I would prefer there to be a sense of anticipation that we can come back to you. So we're going to come to Maggie Browning, member of the Fabian Society, secondary school teacher, who has a question to put to Ash Sarkar. Welcome, Maggie. Let's hear your question. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. So my question's for Ash, and my question is, what can local councillors, especially Labour councillors, do to support a socially just education system on the ground?
Thank you. Very clear question. Ash.
I think one of the things is also looking at the other areas of power which are in the hands of Labour councillors. So, for instance, in the area that I live in, Haringey, the issue of regeneration has become really quite loaded, because for lots of low income people, the idea that a property developer is going to come in, flatten the estate and put up luxury housing, it has a huge impact on the rest of their lives. It has an impact on what schools their kids can attend, whether or not they're going to be in the local area for the foreseeable future. It has an impact on the kind of kinship networks which support and sustain people when they embark on the journey of starting a family and raising kids. So while I think that there's obviously a lot that local Labour councillors can do in terms of supporting children directly, whether that's in education or the role that they can play in making sure that the system for looked after children, i.e. children who are subject to a child protection plan, is properly resourced, I think that Labour councillors should also look quite critically at where regeneration is being targeted, who is it for and who is it benefiting. There was the hugely controversial Haringey development vehicle in my area, which I was ashamed to say was supported by an awful lot of Labour councillors, despite the fact it was plainly obvious it was going to displace a vast number of working class families, mostly families of colour. It's a similar picture that we're seeing around Brick Lane. I also think that there is one thing that I forgot to add in the main bulk of my speech, but I would like to quickly add now, which is thinking about what we think of a job of a teacher to be. And I'm sure that everyone who works in education thinks very critically about this all the time. And I think one of the problems with what we think of as teaching is that we think of it as being a kind of middle-class paratrooper, where the teacher is kind of an envoy from the knowledge economy and is parachuted into a working class school to really teach these kids how to behave. Whereas one of the things which I think is really important is making sure that teaching is an option for people who come from backgrounds who reflect the kind of backgrounds of the kids that they're teaching. One of the best teachers I ever had, Mr. Bryan, who taught us GCSE sociology, he was so sick. He came into education quite late as an adult, and the way in which he was teaching us about these sociological concepts of, you know, norms and mores was telling us this amazing story of having knocked over a drug dealer's chicken at a blues party, right? We all remembered that story for the rest of our lives, and it's because this working class mixed race guy looked like someone we knew, looked like somebody who could be our big brother, our big cousin, one of our uncles. So I think, yeah, in terms of what is it that can be done at the level of local government, I think it's looking at education within the whole in a holistic kind of way. And I think as a sort of separate point, thinking about what we think of the profession of teaching as being.
Thank you very much indeed. I think that's extremely clear. And we now come to Sharon Clancy. Sharon Clancy of the Centenary Commission. I'm just waiting to see Sharon's image. Ah, it's here. You have arrived. Sharon, welcome to our number. Thank you very much indeed. Sharon Clancy of the Centenary Commission, who will put a question to Dr. Alan Bainbridge. Sharon.
Many thanks, John. So many words have been written in particular about lifelong learning as an important means for social justice. How do we re-energize and crucially refund adult education, and not just for skills, for mental health, for personal fulfillment, for political democracy and citizenship?
Sharon, thank you. What say you, Alan?
My first comment is, for whatever reason, I also was dropped out of that. Sharon, I didn't hear your question at all.
Oh, right.
So could you repeat it?
Yes, certainly.
Well, it's good enough to bear repetition.
Here I am.
Okay, so just saying, Alan, that many words have been written about the importance of lifelong learning as a means for social justice. So how do we re-energize at a critical juncture for adult education and crucially fund adult education for mental health, for personal fulfillment, for political democracy and citizenship, and not just for skills?
I think this is the problem of some of these events. There's so much we want to talk about that we can't talk about all of it. One of the things I would love to have mentioned, and I think it's one of the moral outrages of recent times, and that's the way in which we have defunded adult education, lifelong learning, whatever phrases we're going to use there. It seems to have slipped under the radar, and I think that's a terrible indictment, I think, on our political system, that such wonderful resources have disappeared. I think it also links to the conversations that we've had earlier. I don't think there's some magic bullet where we can spend money and, let's say, build new adult education centres in every town, and people will come flooding in. They'll come flooding in for more education. I think there is something about building up within a community, within the population, an understanding and a value of learning and education. And in the context that I work in, I think that's very difficult when you're deemed to fail all the time, when you're seen to be not good enough. The desire to go into adult education when you've spent, all your years up until 18 or whatever it is now, you've failed, you've been deemed to fail, you've gone to the bad school. Why would you want to jump back into that system? So I think it even goes back to the early years. to develop or to encourage, educators say these phrases very easily, a love of learning. I also have to agree with you that the focus on skills and the focus on qualifications for jobs, even at university, talking to my own students, that the number of them see education in quite limited terms now. I think this is a feature of the competitive nature in which we've set up education. I think, Ash, you said this, that we're expecting too much of education. That it's going to solve all of our problems. It's going to get all of us great jobs. Sometimes education is about reading great books or learning about things that you've never bumped into before. It's not easy to say how these things can change very quickly. I think it's a gradual change in the education community, and that might be many of the people who are here. To keep talking out, and again, we don't want to live in a world of binaries, but education isn't just about skills. It isn't just about getting qualification. It's much more than that. And virtually every educator I meet knows that. Yet I'm pretty confident that the new education minister we've got is going to tell us how he's going to level up, increase social mobility, and how we're all going to get fantastic qualifications and get fantastic jobs. And that's not the case. I think there's a job for all of us to do here to hold on to some of those central principles of education being about. Well, again, forgive me if I got this wrong, but I think it's Ash that you said it about being human. That the young people we work with are humans and they have agency. They might not want to do A levels. They might want to do. And this is where again, publicly you get very scared to say other possibilities as if it's demeaning them, but they might be other qualifications they want to do that are of equal value. But it's very hard nowadays to push that through. So I think there's a job for all of us here to maintain that balance of what education is about.
Alan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Now, friends, colleagues, I'm keen to involve others. And my sense is, though I can't find it currently in my chat, but that's my technological ineptitude, there is a question from Fiona Miller, and I would like to have some response to that question. And I think that question, from my recollection of it, is what hope for a socially just education system if the Secretary of State for Education has grammar schools in his or her constituency? And I'm thinking of the current newly appointed Secretary of State for Education, and I'm, as you can tell, looking for assistance on this matter, because I can't recall off the top of my head whether there are grammar schools in Stratford upon Avon. I didn't think that there were, so I don't think Nadeem Zahawi does have grammar schools in his patch, but it is in a sense a byword for a wider question. If the Secretary of State for Education approves of grammar schools and doesn't start from the proposition that they are socially unjust, is that not a bad sign? Somebody has very helpfully educated me and said that there are grammars in S on A. So I will now prize that person, Pip Doran, publicly, because Pip has told everyone that are grammar schools there, by which I'm duly disappointed. So is that not a bad sign? I don't really need long answers on this. I suppose I would just sort of say, given that we're in the here and now, and given that all three of you on this panel are highly articulate, skilled people, in 3 sentences each, how would you try to persuade the government that's on the wrong page to shift to a different page on selection? Let's start with Alan.
Yeah, I think I can be quite brief on this and go back to what I said earlier. If they're of any worth, they should know the evidence. They should know the evidence both from research, and they should know the evidence from the experience on the ground. And if they don't, we should hold them to account. And we don't do that enough. The other part of it, and it's the focus I always take in this debate, at least I try to take, is that I'm always very careful about being negative towards grammar schools, because many friends, colleagues, and those of us here would have gone to schools like that. If you favour grammar schools, you favour selection. If you can find evidence and support the process of selection, then sorry, I've got it the other way around. That's what we have to argue against, because the values and the logic behind the process of selection that underpins grammar schools, and that's what we need to focus on, because that's almost it's an untenable position, both on evidence and values.
What you're really saying, if I understand you correctly, Alan, which seems to me to have an unanswerable logic to it, is that grammar schools aren't bad schools. Grammar schools cause the rest of the system to be bad. And that, in a sense, is what's really objectionable. In order to sustain themselves, everyone else has to suffer. Yes,
I mean, it's similar to, again, what many of my colleagues have said. And again, I'll try and be brief because they all need to talk. I'm not sure there are any bad schools. You know, schools are full of teachers all doing their best with young people in front of them. That we've got ourselves into a frame of mind, and it's because of the competitive nature that we've now set education up in, that we perceive some schools as good and bad. And therefore there's this massive mindset, and we know from the own research done at the university I work in, that even within the House of Commons, the understanding that grammar schools are good is it's just, it overpowers the debate. And just to finish it with a bit of data, if we know from research that we've done in the Houses of Commons, the numbers of times the word good was connected with comprehensive schools in the period we were doing our research was 49, which sounds lovely. But if you were to compare that to the proportion of times that the word good should be linked to comprehensive education, if that proportion was the same as the number of times they use the word good in the context of grammar schools, good and comprehensive should have been mentioned 7,000 times. So a quick bit of maths in my head would suggest that the word good is used 150 times proportionally more in relation to grammar schools than it is to comprehensive education. So there's a whole mindset out there, and you hear it at school gates about the good school and the bad school, and that's part of what we have to do, because it's not the case. It's very hard to have a conversation about a good comprehensive when you only mention it 49 times in the Houses of Parliament rather than 7,000. I think that's the scale of the argument. I'll shut up.
No, thank you, Alan. That's incredibly powerful. Sammy, a couple of sentences, if you feel the need to add.
I think I'd just simply direct the whole debate in a different way. Is, you know, I think what Alan said tells you the difference of scale. We need to worry about selectivity more than grammar schools. Grammar schools are part of the problem of selectivity, but selectivity happens all across the picture, and it happens by house price and by area, admissions criteria, and by faith schools, and by all sorts of different things. So it's selectivity that is the problem, and that's what we need to focus on.
Thank you. Ash?
So I think in terms of answering the question of how do you push this particular government, I think if it were possible to hold this government to account by presenting evidence about what course of action is more conducive to the public good, we would have a very different kind of government than the one that we do. So I'm not sure it is possible to push this particular government, but perhaps it is possible to exploit a political fissure within the current composition of the Conservative Party and this government. Because I think one of the things that we're talking around in lots of ways is the way in which I think the anxieties of middle-class parents shape and dictate education policy. And I think that one of the things that grammar schools do is that they exist in something of a symbiotic relationship with fee-paying schools. And I think the existence of grammar schools gives people a way of participating in a socially segregated educational environment without having to pay fees. And they can say, well, you know, notionally, this is meritocratic. Anyone can be good at that kind of multiple choice question. And it's a way of kind of whitewashing or making palatable the kind of economic inequality which fee-paying schools make explicit. And so I think this idea of the way in which education policy is shaped around middle class anxieties is that it's something which perhaps you can exploit a little bit in terms of, you know, the Red Wall MPs, the 2019 intake, although many of these so-called Red Wall MPs are themselves privately educated and grammar school educated, despite presenting themselves as, you know, tribunes of the working man. But perhaps that is a politically strategic fissure, which is much more, I think, about culture than it is actually about having an economically just vision for the country, which is something that you can push this government and the Conservative Party on. Ultimately, I don't think that this is a government which can really be engaged with on the level of fairness or justice. I think the key is to build an alternative and powerful pole of attraction, whether that is the Labour Party or something else entirely. I leave it up to other people's judgments, but I actually think that the case has to be built elsewhere.
Ash, thank you very much. I want to move on, my friends, to a question from Thelma Walker, former Labour Member of Parliament. Some of you will be aware that she was also a distinguished head teacher. And I often used to reference that fact in the chamber and to suggest that she would not be altogether satisfied with the level of behaviour in the chamber, but would be a very good role model for others. Now, Thelma has a question which relates to the chair of the Select Committee on Education, Robert Halfon, who's a very thoughtful chair of the Select Committee. He is the Conservative chair of the Select Committee, and Robert Halfon has referred to the ladder of opportunity in education and in life. And her question is, does that ladder of opportunity exist? I mean, it's a very long established rhetorical phrase, and I'm sure it's what Robert believes and wants to see, but does it actually exist?
Can I jump in on this one?
Please, Sammy.
So this is obviously something that the Social Mobility Commission look at a lot. Excuse me. And the point I would make is that we did a piece of work called The Long Shadow of Deprivation that came out in autumn last year. And what we found is that in some areas, even though we have this difference in educational attainment between those who are disadvantaged and those who are non-disadvantaged, if you get the grades, in some areas, that can then lead to equal opportunity later in life. But there are other areas where someone from a disadvantaged background, even if they have the same educational attainment as someone from a non-disadvantaged background, has as much as a third pay gap by the age of 28.
Yep.
So I think the answer is there are some ladders, but there are plenty of places in the UK where that ladder is irretrievably broken.
Yes, I mean, I don't want to jest. I don't want to jest, Sammy, in what is a very serious webinar. But on the other hand, we are approaching Sunday lunchtime, and there must be some room for historical reminiscence and humour. And I do recall in the mid-1980s, colleagues, watching BBC Question Time long before I ever appeared on it. And I remember a splendid tussle, well, it was actually pretty one-sided really, between Tony Benn and Roy Jenkins. And Tony Benn, in that marvellous way of his, which I can't really imitate very successfully, but I'll try, said, let me be candid, Roy. Let me be candid. You and I have known each other a very long time. Roy, your father was a miner. Your grandfather was a miner. Roy, you climbed the ladder and then you kicked the ladder away, he said. And it was about 1985, but I have remembered that for the last 36 years. And I've often reminded Melissa of it. Actually, I occasionally reminded Tony of it himself. And I think I, in some ways, almost remembered it better than he did, but it was a very striking point that what he was really saying is you benefited, you climbed up, and you seem to have lost sight of the very people from whom you came. So I think really what Sammy said is, yeah, there are some ladders, but there are quite a lot of places where the ladders either have never existed, haven't been manufactured, or have just been deliberately, by acts of public policy, torn down. So, you know, we've not really got much to congratulate ourselves on, I'm afraid. Now, I would quite like to continue in this controversial mode. And I see that one of our contributors has said, I think it's Patrick Ainley, that he thinks that the discussion, I'm not sure he's being quite fair about this, but it's suitably provocative anyway. He says that he thinks the discussion is proceeding from the premise that private schools are there, they're sort of extant, but that they're not particularly relevant to the debate about inequality. The whole discussion is about selection and so on. And I think what he's saying is that the discriminatory attitude, you know, the assumptions of superiority and inferiority, what's good and what's not good, in a sense, hail from, are inextricably bound up with the question of whether we have a private sector. If Patrick feels that I have misrepresented him and wishes to subject me to excoriating attack, well, then I will bear that with such stoicism and fortitude as I can muster. But I think that's the thrust of what he's saying. And it allows me to ask people if I could just tempt them. I know Fiona Miller did a debate the other night on private schools. It is something of an elephant in the room, is it not, that we've still got 7% of kids who go to fee-paying schools. And in a sense, it's not much discussed day to day, and none of the major political parties is currently committed to changing that situation. Another questioner said, you know, is there any chance Labour might develop some policies on education anytime soon? So what do you all think about the private sector element of the equation?
Let me get in on this one. Let me get in on this one. Let me get in on this one, because I feel so strongly about this.
Please,
look,
Ash.
The private education system in this country is an affront to the values of equality, democracy, and fairness. I think that it is an unalloyed bad. I think that it essentially produces a privilege to privilege pipeline for those who have the good fortune to be born into some measure of economic privilege, and just keeps that truck going. But I also think in terms of the culture which is reinforced in the fee-paying system and the way in which it's then reproduced in our public institutions is also very, very toxic. The idea that you can pay a fee, one, to make sure that your kid is part of that 7% who is overwhelmingly represented in the upper echelons of public life, I think is grotesque, but also the message that it sends to everybody else who's part of the 93%, which is there's something about your kids. They're uncouth, they're thick, they're violent, they're dirty, they're nasty, and I will pay through the nose to make sure that, you know, my precious little angel doesn't have to sit next to your kid, right? I think it is absolutely an affront to all the values we claim to hold as a society. Now, there's a lot of controversy about whether or not you can pursue the Finnish model of essentially banning fee-paying schools and, you know, having a wholesale integration of the fee-paying sector into the state school sector. And I think that you guys obviously have a lot more expertise than I do. I'm just a namby-pamby literature graduate. I don't really know about laws. What I think that you could do, and watch as the fee-paying sector withers after you implement this rule, is cap the number of privately educated people allowed to work in the civil service, or allowed to be represented in Parliament, or allowed to work at the BBC, or allowed to work in the judiciary at 7%. right? Make them have to play the same percentages as the rest of us do, and watch as the fee paying system absolutely collapses on its face.
Well, that really has got the debate going fantastically. So thank you, Ash. Alan or Sammy, do you want to come in on that? Alan, please.
I'm only going to add one or two bits. Yeah, Ash, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I could have told that story of Kent in a different way, because I could have told what's it like to stand at the bus stop with children going to the fee-paying school. What's it like for me when I cycle past the fee-paying school with their huge grounds and huge resources? I think this pipeline to privilege argument around fee-paying schools is a very valid one, and they are reproduced in so many ways. If it's the wearing of caps when you're 7 years old and a blazer when you're 3 to go to school, to the types of sports you play, that's reproduced or been reproduced so much in recent years, as schools are part of a competitive regime. For whatever reason, it seemed to copy what the fee-paying schools do. And the only caveat I would put on it, I would try and be very, very delicate about this, is that I think there is space for children who have very particular needs. That there might be fee-paying schools for them. But even saying that, I'm very disappointed to say it, because repeatedly governments don't seem to be able to find enough money to look after all the children and all the diverse needs that we have. But certainly there are some fee-paying schools, and I would say locally near me, there are schools linked to autism and deafness that do a very good job. And it's just, again, I could argue it's immoral in a way that our government don't see fit to pay for those, and it has to come out of other people's pockets. But yeah, Ash, I'm on your side.
Thank you. Sam?
Just to add to it, I think the important thing to understand, I'm going to make the same point I made earlier, is we've got to also flip the discussion. The reason that private schools are attractive is because the level of jeopardy in our society is too high. The downside, the other side of social mobility is downward mobility. And if you fear that your children turning out to be plasterers is a nightmare for you, then you bolster that any way that you can. Whereas if you look at countries that have a higher level of general equality of income and living standards, such as, for example, Denmark, there isn't the same incentive to put your kids into private schools. So I'm going to just make that same plea. Let's not see education as something separate from society. Let's fix society, and then education can fit in with that.
Thank you, Sammy. I'm going to float another question to you, which is not specifically on the private sector, but in fact, really coming back to the issue of selection. Melissa Ben wants to know, why is it that mainstream politicians in the major parties fight shy of addressing the issue of selection? And I think, very specifically, I extrapolate from what Melissa has said, that what she's really getting at is, why does the Labour Party not come out explicitly against the selective system, given that the selective system operates only in a small number of areas, and there's no evidence that it is vastly popular with or part of the everyday experience or ambition of most parents? Why is it that it continues to have this silencing effect, if you like, on elected politicians who probably aren't enthusiasts for it, but don't seem to want to say anything about it, still less to do anything about it? Why is that?
I'm going to mention from my context living in Kent, because we've met with our elected members in the local authority, and we've shown them the evidence, and nothing happens. They fight shy of it. I think this is a really difficult problem, and I would be welcome for advice from either anybody on the panel or anybody who's out there participating. I mean, the best I can come up with is it's to do with votes and job protections for reasons that again are very difficult to find direct causal mechanisms. I think Sammy alluded to earlier on, possibly it's the jeopardy that you have in society, and therefore these sorts of schools hold out, I would argue, unrealistic hope. And as a politician, you want to present hope. So there is this, and that's why I sort of mentioned it in what I was talking about, there is this almost duplicitous political stance that if you go to this type of good school, you will do well. And that's not the case. It's capturing that debate. And politicians seem so unwilling to deal with the difficulty of possibly upsetting people by saying, oh, this grammar school thing, and I know it's about selection, but in the context of what we're talking, this grammar school thing or this private school, this is going to solve all your problems. I think there's possibly an argument that the comprehensive movement hasn't sold its story well enough either, and therefore you don't see that as the solution. I mean, wouldn't it be wonderful to have adverts on television of, I went to a comprehensive school and this is what I did, and I didn't pay for it. Yeah, it's free.
Yeah. Alan, I take that point, and I think it's a very fair one. I think I myself, for example, I went to a comprehensive school, I've never really spoken with any great enthusiasm about it, partly because I think that the best comprehensives today are much better than the one that I attended. But nevertheless, it is a valuable corrective to the discussion that lots of people talk about their very successful experience at grammar school, or their very, in inverted commas, good, close inverted commas, school when it was a fee-paying school and how lucky they were and so on. But not that many people talk about the great comprehensive that they attended, and perhaps if more did, that would shift the terms of trade, including, as you say, Alan, in the chamber of the House of Commons. Does anybody else want to add anything on this question? Why has it been ducked? Because this is key. You may not expect a Conservative government to do anything about the selective system, and it's made it clear that it doesn't intend to do so. But presumably, elections are supposed to be about choices. And so there should be a choice that is open to you if you vote for a different kind of government, and that choice ought to include the option of a very different and more just education system without selection. Ash, why is nobody broaching it, even though you are, but nobody in the House of Commons is, nobody in the upper echelons of the Labour Party is doing so?
I mean, I think we've got to talk about the ways in which the Labour Party is deeply wedded to classism, deeply wedded to a narrative that the decent working class is aspirational and upwardly mobile, and there is a kind of indecent, underclass of people who experience, intergenerational deprivation, who have been unable to climb one of those ladders of opportunity, which Robert Halfren talks about, which essentially is a way of rising out of your class, either you yourself alone or your household, but it's a way in which you leave your community behind because you see them as kind of, a human cesspit of unproductive and socially corrosive values. And I think, I'm ashamed to say that the Labour Party and also the wider left, I think, is also invested in this idea of the kind of, decent and deserving working class, which is upwardly mobile, and the undeserving working class. And I think this comes back to the point which Sammy has made very articulately about the flip side to social mobility is downward mobility. And it's not just about economic precarity, although of course that's there. It's not just about what it's like to live without a house or in incredibly low wage, precarious and low status work. But it's also about the loss of that cultural and social status as well. What does it say about you if you're one of the families which was depicted on Benefit Street? Or, you've got all of the kind of cultural signifiers of being a member of a so-called underclass, that kind of proximity to abjectness and criminality, which are just really the social symptoms of economic deprivation, a lack of resources, and a sense that, you know, not just you can be airlifted and winched out of your community, but there can be a rising tide which lifts all boats. And unfortunately, the Labour Party, I think in its and this is a problem which goes much deeper than any one leader of the Labour Party. I always think about Tony Blair sending his kids to the London Oratory because, God forbid, his children only became doctors or lawyers. You know, it is really an investment in upward mobility and retaining a society which is still very much stratified by class, but has got new ways of blaming people for their immiserated conditions, if indeed they live in them.
Thank you, Ash. Emmy?
Yeah, all I would say on this is I personally am politically non-aligned because I find it very difficult how people bunch whole bunches of things together under the umbrella of one party as if they automatically go together. And we need to remember that the Labour Party was the one that didn't get rid of private schools in the 60s when they had the opportunity. And that was the one clear chance we've had to do it. So again and again, you know, academisation, that's Labour policy. So I'm not defending anyone and not aligning myself either way, but I think that to expect one party to automatically come to the rescue on this is naive when we look at the history of politics in this country. And I think we have to make the case for policies, not parties.
Thank you. Okay, well, there's all sorts of comments in the chat, and somebody who's just offered the view that the Labour Party didn't oppose grammar schools because that might have caused the Labour Party post-1997 to lose the support of the Murdoch empire. Well, that is certainly a very clear point of view, and I can understand where that person is coming from. And others have referenced, as you'll see, colleagues, in the chat, the phenomenon of academisation. And it's quite interesting because here are two words, comprehensive and academy. And somebody made the point a few moments ago that comprehensive's got a very bad press, literally in the press, and that academies are somehow thought to be a superior variant thereof. Well, that in itself is a debatable point. They may be in some respects and not in others. One thing that I think there's quite a lot of evidence for, I won't say more about this today, is that there are real issues of accountability with academies and lack thereof in relation to the communities in which they're situated, and sometimes a wider lack of accountability as well. So, you know, some of those arguments don't get played out in the public square, but perhaps they ought to do so. Sadly, my friends, all good things come to an end. And although I exhort, I will seek to cajole and persuade the members of the panel and others involved in the organisation of this event not to disappear immediately. Please don't leave, because I think we can usefully foregather at the end just to exchange a few words. But I'm afraid I think, and with some encouragement from the person who directs me at Comprehensive Future, I'm really just the front person, but with due deference to Joanne Bartley, our wonderful administrator, I am exhorted to bring the proceedings to an end for today. But I must emphasize, colleagues and friends, for today, this debate is not a fact, it's a process, it's not a one-off, it's an ongoing debate between, I hope, people of goodwill as to how we can fashion and nurture a better, more socially just, more constructive education system. That debate will go on and on and on for months, years, decades and beyond. And we just have to keep engaging with the issues. And a little earlier, it was said by one of our panelists that perhaps no different could be expected from the current government, but that it had to be held to account. And that really is at the core of things. I would invite any frustrated members of our virtual audience to recognize how central that point really is to all political debate. You know, you will know that I sat in that chair of the Chamber of the House of Commons for over a decade, and other than in the 2017 to 19 Parliament, when there was no absolute majority and therefore there were lots of uncertain votes, most of the time on most issues, most if not all of the votes were entirely predictable, and that was true for other speakers before me, and it will be true for speakers after me, for the simple reason that the government of the day had a substantial majority and was very unlikely to lose votes at all often. Did that therefore render the proceedings pointless? And I think that the answer to that is definitely not. It absolutely didn't render them pointless, because debate is of the essence, and people with power have to be questioned, probed, scrutinized, challenged, held to account, exposed from time to time for errors of omission or commission. And it's a forum also, Parliament is a forum also in which people have the opportunity, it's not the only forum, but it's a forum in which people have the opportunity to express themselves and to paint an alternative picture, to develop an alternative narrative, to chart an alternative course for their communities and for the country. And frankly, if people give up on that, well, then they're giving up on the democratic process and giving up on the chance of a better future. And I know none of us wants to do that. So for now, I want to say to everybody who's had a hand in organising today's event, Joanne Bartley has been an absolutely first-class person for that purpose. A big thank you. I want to say, whilst appealing to them to remain with me, a huge, heartfelt thanks to our panel, which I hope you will agree, my friends, has been serious, stellar, and superb. It really has been a quite exceptional panel, and I'm incredibly grateful to all members of that panel. And ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you, because otherwise we'd be talking purely to ourselves. I know we've not been talking purely to ourselves. We've been talking to a significant number of people who've given up their late Sunday morning and early afternoon to engage with what I will call the we, not just the me. That sense that there's something beyond merely our own personal experience that matters and that is worthy of exchange, of dialogue, of testing each other's hypotheses and seeing if we can come up with something better in the future than we've had in the past or are saddled with at present. So I'm very, very, very appreciative, ladies and gentlemen, of all of you. For those of you who have been dissatisfied, those of you who've not got in, those of you who disapproved of what's been said or disapproved of my attempted chairing of it, my profuse apologies. I've done my level best, which is all I could do, but I hope that we'll all agree that the panel have been terrific. It's been a great event, and I hope that there will be more such events. I promise not to pick it. I won't come uninvited, but if Comprehensive Future wants me to come again and have the privilege of chairing top quality speakers and listening to an interrogative audience, then I would be delighted in my capacity as patron to do just that. Thank you, and I say to all of you, you have well and truly earned your Sunday lunch. Thank you, and goodbye.